library had closed an hour ago, yet he was still there, sitting in the same chair, flipping through the same book. But that book, it shouldn't even exist anymore. The haunted library, Margaret Lane, had been the head librarian at Blackwood Public Library for over 20 years. She had witnessed all kinds of visitors, college students cramming for exams, elderly patrons reading quietly, and the occasional wanderer seeking warmth on cold nights. But this man was different. He arrived every evening, just before sunset, dressed in an old-fashioned black coat and a dark hat that shadowed most of his face. He never spoke, never checked out books, and always sat at the same corner table, absorbed in his reading. At first, Margaret thought little of it. Some people just liked their routines. But then she noticed something strange. He was always reading the same book, a thick, leather-bound tome with faded gold lettering on the spine. She had never seen it before, and more importantly, she had never cataloged it. One evening, as she made her final rounds before closing, she decided to get a closer look. She walked toward the man, clearing her throat softly to announce her presence. "Excuse me, sir. We're closing in 5 minutes." The man didn't respond. His pale fingers turned another brittle page, his posture unchanging. Margaret leaned slightly, trying to see the book's title, but the letters were too worn to read. Still, something about it felt wrong. A strange sensation crept up her spine, like she was looking at something that shouldn't be there. She sighed and straightened up. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave." This time, the man slowly lifted his head. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark and sunken, as if he hadn't slept in years. He stared at her for a long moment, then, without a word, closed the book, stood up, and walked away. Margaret watched him go, the sound of his slow footsteps echoing in the empty library. When she turned back to the table, the book was gone. The next night, he was back. Same chair, same book. Margaret decided she needed answers. That evening, as soon as he left, she rushed to the security office and pulled up the camera feed. She fast-forwarded through the footage, watching the man arrive, sit, and read. But when she reached the part where he left, the screen glitched. 1 second he was there. The next, he was gone. No movement, no departure, just an empty chair. A cold dread settled in her chest. She rewound and played it again. The same thing happened. He simply vanished. Margaret leaned back in her chair, rubbing her arms as a chill passed through her. This wasn't possible. Determined, she went to the archives the next morning, searching for records of the book. She combed through old inventory lists, but there was no mention of anything resembling the tome the man had been reading. Frustrated, she decided to check the restricted vault, a section of the library where rare and delicate books were stored. She unlocked the heavy door and stepped inside, the scent of aged paper filling the air. And then she saw it. The book. It sat on a wooden shelf covered in dust, its spine cracked with age. Her breath hitched. How could it be here when she had just seen it in the man's hands last night? Heart pounding, she reached for it. But the moment her fingers brushed the leather cover, a whispering voice filled the room. "Margaret." She yanked her hand back, spinning around, but there was no one there. The vault was empty. Her pulse raced. Was she imagining things? Was the stress of work finally getting to her? Taking a deep breath, She grabbed the book and carefully carried it to her desk. She had to know what was inside. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with old handwriting in ink that had faded over time. The language was archaic, but she could make out fragments, bound by knowledge, cursed to read, until the final page turns. A sudden gust of wind swept through the library. Though the windows were shut, the lights flickered. Margaret shivered. That night, she didn't go home. She stayed hidden in the security office, waiting, watching. At exactly 9 p.m., the man appeared again. But this time, when he lifted his head, his hollow eyes stared directly into the camera, and he smiled. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the monitor. The man had never once looked at the cameras before, but tonight, he did. His hollow, sunken eyes locked onto the lens, as if he knew she was watching. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands and opened the book again. Margaret's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she hesitated. Should she call someone? The police? But what would she even say? There's a man in my library who reads a book that shouldn't exist and disappears into thin air. She shook her head. No one would believe her. Gathering her courage, she left the security office and stepped back into the darkened library. The air was unnaturally still. Each footstep echoed louder than it should have, making her feel as if she weren't alone, even though she could see no one else. As she rounded the corner, she froze. The man was exactly where she had seen him on the screen, seated at his usual table, absorbed in the same book. Margaret's mouth went dry. She had locked the doors. How had he gotten inside? Her hands clenched into fists as she took a deep breath. If he had broken in, she had every right to confront him. She forced herself to step forward. "Sir," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "The library is closed. You need to leave." The man didn't react. His long, bony fingers turned another page. Margaret swallowed her fear and walked closer. "Sir, I'm talking to you." Still nothing. Her frustration overtook her fear. If he wasn't going to listen, she would just take the book from him. She reached out, and the moment her fingers brushed the pages, a shock of ice shot through her arm. She gasped, yanking her hand back. The cold spread up her wrist, numbing her fingers. She stumbled backward, staring at her hand. Her skin was pale, almost bluish, like frostbite had set in. Her gaze snapped back to the man. He was looking at her, not just looking, staring. And this time, he spoke. "You shouldn't have touched it." His voice was hollow, as if it came from deep within an empty well. Margaret's heart pounded. Who are you?" The man closed the book with a soft thud. The air around them grew heavier, suffocating. "I was like you once," he murmured. "Curious, a librarian just like you." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "This book," he said, resting a pale hand on the cover, "does not belong in this world." Margaret took a shaky step back. "Then where does it belong?" The man's expression darkened. "Where all forgotten things go." A flickering light above them buzzed loudly before going out. For a brief second, the library was plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, the man was gone. The chair sat empty. The book was gone too. Margaret's breaths came fast and shallow. Her eyes darted around the library, but there was no sign of him. This wasn't possible. Her hand still tingled from the icy shock. She rubbed her fingers together, trying to shake off the numbness, but the sensation lingered. She needed answers. Rushing to the archives, she pulled out every record she could find on the library's history. There were mentions of renovations, expansions, even a fire in the early 1900s, but nothing about a missing book. Then, as she flipped through an old newspaper article, a name caught her eye. Edgar Whitmore, Blackwood Library head librarian, 1876 to 1902. The article was about his disappearance. Margaret's heart pounded as she read. Edgar Whitmore, longtime librarian of Blackwood Library, was last seen in the restricted archives on the night of November 3rd, 1902. His belongings were found intact, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. However, his personal journal was discovered open on his desk, with the final entry reading, "The book is calling to me. I must know the truth. If I do not return, let this serve as a warning. Some knowledge is meant to remain buried." Margaret's hands trembled as she set the article down. The man, the one who came every night, was he, Edgar Whitmore? A whisper of wind rustled the papers in front of her, though there were no open windows. The air smelled faintly of old books and something else, something decayed. She turned, pulse hammering, and gasped. The book was sitting on the table in front of her. It hadn't been there a second ago. The leather cover looked older now, almost as if it had been left to rot for centuries. The gold lettering was faint, but this time she could just barely make out the title. The Book of Lost Souls. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave it alone. But deep inside, she knew she wouldn't. She had already started down this path, and now there was no turning back. Margaret stared at the book, her breath shallow. The worn leather cover seemed to pulse under the dim library lights. She hadn't brought it here. It had appeared on its own. A rational part of her mind told her to leave, to walk away, lock the doors, and forget she had ever seen it. But she had never been one to ignore a mystery. Carefully, she reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, a cold shock ran up her arm. The same sensation as before. She winced, but didn't let go. She had to know the truth. Slowly, she opened the book. The pages were brittle, filled with handwritten text in old-fashioned script. Some words had faded beyond recognition, but she could still make out parts of it. Bound by knowledge, cursed to read, until the final page turns. Margaret's pulse quickened. The same words she had glimpsed before. She flipped another page. The ink was darker here, as if the writer had pressed the pen harder, the strokes desperate. To those who find this book, know this: it does not belong to the living. To read is to be seen. To turn its pages is to invite them closer. And if you reach the end, the sentence stopped abruptly. Margaret exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Who had written this? Edgar Whitmore. A sudden whisper brushed against her ear, too close, though she was alone. Margaret, she gasped, slamming the book shut and whipping around. Nothing. The library was empty, its towering shelves stretching into the dimness. But something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with an unseen presence. The lights flickered again, casting shifting shadows across the walls. Margaret clenched her fists to steady herself. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. You're overtired. She had to focus. Taking the book, she rushed back to the security office. She needed to check the cameras again. As she fast-forwarded through the footage of the night, her stomach twisted. The man, Edgar, had been sitting at his usual table. But this time, something was different. The shadows around him were moving. Not like the flickering of the lights. These were distinct figures, shifting and writhing, circling him like they were waiting for something. Then, at exactly midnight, Edgar lifted his head and turned to the final page of the book. The moment he did, the shadows surged forward. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth as the screen glitched violently. For a split second, she thought she saw something. Faces in the darkness, twisted and hollow-eyed. Then the footage cut out. When it resumed, the chair was empty. Edgar was gone. Margaret's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She turned to look at the book on the desk beside her. Was this what had happened to Edgar Whitmore all those years ago? Had he read to the end? And her thoughts were cut short by a loud thump from the main hall. Her entire body stiffened. Someone was in the library. Margaret grabbed her phone and hesitated. Call the police? But what would she even say? That a ghostly figure had been haunting her library. That a cursed book had appeared out of nowhere. Another sound, this time, the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the wooden floor. She wasn't alone. Gripping her phone, she slowly stepped out of the security office. The main hall was shrouded in shadows, the overhead lights dim and flickering. She turned the corner and froze. At the center of the library, Edgar stood, facing the restricted archives. But something was wrong. The air around him seemed to ripple, like heat rising from pavement. And his figure, it was flickering as if he weren't entirely solid. Margaret swallowed hard. Edgar, he didn't move. She stepped closer. What happened to you? Finally, he turned. His face was pale, his eyes sunken deeper than before. You opened it, he said quietly. Margaret's grip tightened on her phone. What is this book? Edgar looked at her with something almost like pity. A doorway. Margaret's blood ran cold. A doorway to what? A gust of wind tore through the library, rattling the shelves. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Margaret could see her own breath. Edgar stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. They've seen you. Now, the lights flickered violently, and for the first time, Margaret felt it. Something was here. Not Edgar. Something else. A presence loomed in the air, unseen but oppressive. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Then, from behind her, a voice, low, guttural, and not human. Turn the page, Margaret. She spun around. Nothing. Her breathing was ragged, her pulse racing. Edgar shook his head. You don't understand. Once the book is opened, it must be finished. Margaret's mind whirled. A curse, a trap. If she stopped reading, would she end up like Edgar, trapped between worlds? Her gaze dropped to the book in her hands. The pages seemed to hum with energy, as if they were waiting. She had already turned 2 pages. There were still many left. Edgar's voice was barely audible now. lost beneath the rising whisper of unseen things. "You have to keep reading." Margaret's hands trembled. She had no choice. She turned the page. Margaret's fingers trembled as she turned to the next page. The whispers grew louder, curling around her ears like unseen tendrils. The words on the page shifted, ink twisting unnaturally, as if the book were alive. The reader is bound. The reader is watched. The reader must finish. A shiver ran down her spine. She glanced up, but Edgar was gone. The library was eerily silent, the only sound her own shallow breathing. Had he vanished again? Or was he ever really there? Margaret took a deep breath. She had two choices: resist whatever force this was, and risk being trapped like Edgar, or continue reading and hope she could find a way to break the curse. She pressed forward, her eyes scanning the page. In the year 1902, the librarian of Blackwood made a mistake. He read beyond the warning, beyond the threshold. He became part of the book, a soul lost to the ink, forever watching, forever waiting. Her heart pounded. This was about Edgar. A new paragraph formed before her eyes, the ink seeping through the paper like fresh blood. "And now, Margaret Caldwell follows," she gasped, shoving the book away. The pages fluttered as it landed on the table, but it didn't close. The words still shifted, forming new sentences as if responding to her actions. A soft creak sounded behind her. Margaret turned slowly. At the end of the aisle, just beyond the dim glow of the emergency lights, stood a figure. Not Edgar this time. Something else. Its form was hazy, shifting like smoke, but its eyes, two deep hollow voids, were fixed on her. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The book hummed, a low vibration that she could feel in her bones. "Turn the page, Margaret." The voice wasn't coming from the figure. It was inside her head. She stumbled back, her mind racing. If Edgar was telling the truth, she had to keep reading. But what if that was exactly what they wanted? Another whisper. This time, closer. "If you stop now, you will stay here forever." Margaret clenched her fists. No, she wasn't going to be another forgotten name in this cursed book's pages. She grabbed the book again, forcing herself to look at the next passage. There is one way out. A name must be written. A name must take the place of the reader. Her stomach twisted. A sacrifice. A chilling realization settled over her. Edgar had never finished the book. That's why he was trapped. He had no one to take his place. Was that what the entity wanted from her? To choose someone else? Her mind raced. Could she trick it? Could she write down a name that wasn't real? The shadows around her thickened, creeping along the floor like inky tendrils. The figure at the end of the aisle took a slow step forward. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to act fast. She reached for a pen and hesitated. If she wrote a name, even a fake one, was she just feeding the curse? Another step. The figure was closer now, its form still shifting, but its intent was clear. Time is running out. Margaret gritted her teeth. She wasn't going to let this thing win. She grabbed the pen, and instead of writing a new name, she scrawled across the page in bold strokes. No more names. No more souls. The moment the ink touched the paper, the library trembled. A low, guttural sound filled the air, somewhere between a growl and a scream. The shadows recoiled, writhing as if in agony. Margaret held her breath. Had she done something? The book shuddered violently. The words on the page dissolved, ink bleeding through as if rejecting her defiance. Then, the lights flickered back to full brightness. The air shifted, losing its suffocating weight. The figure was gone. Margaret blinked, her breath coming in short gasps. She glanced down at the book. The pages were blank. No more shifting ink. No more whispers. Silence. Her hands trembled as she shut the book. Had she broken the curse? She stood there for a long moment, waiting, expecting something else to happen. But nothing did. Then, from the far end of the library, a voice, soft, familiar. "Thank you." Margaret turned, but there was no one there. She exhaled shakily, gripping the book one last time. It was over, or at least she hoped it was. Margaret stood in the center of the library, gripping the now blank book as silence stretched around her. The entity was gone. The whispers had faded. Even the air felt lighter, as if the weight of unseen eyes had lifted. But she wasn't ready to trust it just yet. She carefully turned the pages, blank, every single one. The sinister ink that had twisted into words, warnings, and threats had disappeared. Had she really broken the curse? Margaret wasn't sure, but she wasn't going to take any chances. She needed to get rid of the book. The next morning, she arrived at the library before dawn. The sky outside was still dark, the streets empty. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe her? Walking into the restricted archives, she carried the book in both hands. Its weight heavier than before. Maybe it was psychological, or maybe something still lingered within it. She reached the vault, the same one where the book had been locked away for decades. The heavy metal door creaked as she pulled it open. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ancient texts, each one carrying its own history. But this book, this was different. She hesitated for a moment before placing it inside. As soon as the book touched the shelf, the lights flickered, just for a second. Margaret held her breath. Nothing else happened. Slowly, she shut the vault door and locked it. She even ran her fingers over the edges, making sure there were no gaps, no way for it to slip free again. Still, something gnawed at her. She stepped back, staring at the heavy door. Was that enough? Would the book stay locked away this time? Or would it find another way out? Over the next few days, Margaret watched the library closely. No sign of Edgar. No strange shadows. No flickering lights or whispering voices. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. The book had been locked away once before, yet it had returned. Would it happen again? One night, as she was closing up, she decided to check the security footage one last time. She fast-forwarded through the recordings, her eyes scanning for anything unusual. At first, nothing. Then, at exactly midnight, the footage glitched. Margaret's breath caught. The screen flickered violently for several seconds before stabilizing. And there, in the center of the main hall, a book sat on the table. Not just any book. That book. Margaret's stomach turned to ice. The vault was locked. She had checked it herself. Yet somehow, the book was back. The footage continued playing. At 12:01 a.m., the book slowly opened. as if an invisible hand was turning the pages. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. Then, just before the footage cut out, she saw it. A figure, standing in the far corner of the library, watching. And just before the screen went black, a whisper crackled through the speakers. Not finished. The library was silent, the lights steady. Everything looked normal. But Margaret knew better. The book wasn't gone, and neither was whatever had been bound to it. She slowly closed her laptop, exhaling shakily. This wasn't over. Not yet.